All right, so today we are diving deep into media manipulation and fake news. We've got some really interesting sources to unpack here. One of them is this website called Church of Satan News, Media ENC, which I know the name is a little bit startling, but it actually offers some pretty pointed critiques of media practices. And then to kind of broaden our perspective, we'll also be looking at excerpts from Wikipedia's entry on fake news.
Yeah, it's fascinating how these sources, while coming from very different perspectives, they both raise some red flags about how information is being shaped and presented to influence our understanding of the world.
Exactly. And for those of you listening, we want this deep dive to help you become a more savvy consumer of information. We're going to kind of explore some of the tactics that are used to manipulate media narratives and look at how you can spot those red flags yourself.
Yeah, one of the most intriguing concepts that both sources touch on is this idea of forbidden subjects, topics that are seemingly off limits or deliberately suppressed by mainstream media. The Church of Satan News, for example, specifically points to chemtrails and orgonite as examples.
Okay, so what's the deal with those topics? Why would they be considered forbidden?
Well, both chemtrails and orgonite have become somewhat focal points for alternative theories and beliefs. Chemtrails, the idea that airplane contrails are actually chemical or biological agents being dispersed for some nefarious purposes, those have been debunked by scientists, but continue to hold a grip on the public imagination. Orgonite, mixture of resin, metals, and quartz, is said to harmonize and cleanse energy. It's often associated with New Age, spirituality, and alternative health practices.
Okay, so is it that these topics are inherently dangerous? Or is it more that they're challenging established narratives? I mean, the source seems to suggest that there are powerful entities actively working to keep these subjects out of the public eye. Do you think there's any truth to that?
It's certainly possible that certain groups or institutions might see these topics as threatening to their interests or their agendas, and the very act of labeling something as forbidden can ironically fuel curiosity and make it more alluring to certain audiences.
It's like the Streisand effect, right? The more you try to suppress something, the more attention it gets.
Precisely. And this kind of ties into another key tactic of media manipulation, and that's the use of fear. Church of Satan News is very critical of what they see as fear-mongering in the media, particularly around health topics like vaccines.
Yeah, they even name specific journalists and call them vaccine fearmongers, which is a pretty strong accusation. Do you think it's fair to single out individuals like that?
It's important to remember that this source is expressing a particular viewpoint, and it's always wise to approach accusations with a healthy dose of skepticism. But it's undeniable that fear is a powerful tool that can be used to manipulate public opinion and influence behavior.
Yeah, I mean, think about those commercials for cleaning products that show like microscopic images of germs lurking everywhere. They're totally playing on our fear of contamination to sell us their products.
Exactly. And this tactic can be especially effective when it comes to health. If people are afraid of getting sick, they're more likely to accept solutions that are offered to them, even if those solutions aren't really supported by solid evidence.
So how do we, as critical thinkers, navigate this landscape of potential manipulation? I mean, the term fake news gets thrown around a lot these days, but it's not always clear what it actually means.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's something that the Wikipedia article really digs into. Defining fake news is surprisingly complex. It's evolved from simply being inaccurate information to a more weaponized term used to discredit opponents or sources that you just disagree with.
So it's not just about whether something is factually true or false.
Right. Fake news can take many forms: completely fabricated stories, headlines that twist the truth, satire that gets mistaken as fact, and even intentionally misleading information designed to sway public opinion.
That's quite a spectrum. I mean, Church of Satan News actually provides a list of media outlets and journalists that they accuse of spreading fake news. It's a pretty extensive list, and some of the names on it are pretty surprising.
It is an extensive list, and it's important to remember that these are accusations from a source with a very specific agenda. But it does raise the critical point of always considering the source of your information and understanding their motivations.
Okay, so let's say we come across a piece of news or information online. What are some practical steps we can take to assess its credibility?
One of the first things to do is consider the source. Is it a reputable news organization? Do they have a history of accuracy and impartiality? What's their funding model? Are they transparent about who supports them?
Yeah, it's like checking the credentials of anyone you'd trust with important information. You wouldn't take medical advice from somebody who isn't a doctor, right?
Exactly. And in the digital age, we need to be just as discerning about our information sources. Another crucial step is to read beyond the headline. Headlines are designed to grab attention, but they can often be misleading or oversimplified.
I'm definitely guilty of just skimming headlines sometimes. But you're saying it's important to dig deeper and read the full article to get the whole picture.
Absolutely. And while you're reading, pay attention to the tone and the language that's used. Is it overly sensationalized or emotional? Are they using fear-mongering tactics or making sweeping generalizations? These can all be red flags that the information is being presented in a way that is manipulative.
It's like that saying, if it bleeds, it leads, right?
Yeah.
The more shocking or dramatic a story is, the more likely it is to go viral, regardless of its accuracy. And social media seems to really accelerate that phenomenon.
You're right. Social media platforms have become both breeding grounds for misinformation and powerful amplifiers for it. The algorithms used by these platforms are designed to keep you engaged. And often that means prioritizing content that triggers strong emotions, regardless of its truthfulness.
So even if we're trying to be careful about what we share, those algorithms can still push misleading content our way. It feels like we're constantly bombarded with information these days, and it's just so hard to filter it all.
It's a real challenge. And it's exacerbated by something called confirmation bias, which is our tendency to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs and dismiss information that challenges them.
So if someone already believes in a conspiracy theory, for example, they're more likely to click on articles that support that theory, even if those articles are full of misinformation.
Exactly. And this creates echo chambers where misinformation can flourish. It's one of the reasons why fake news can spread so rapidly and have such a powerful impact. But it's not all doom and gloom. Both of our sources point out that social media companies are taking steps to combat the spread of fake news on their platforms.
Oh, that's good. What kind of steps are they taking? Are they actually making a difference?
Well, they're experimenting with things like fact-checking programs, labeling questionable content, and even banning repeat offenders who consistently spread misinformation. But it's a bit like playing whack-a-mole. As soon as they address one issue, another one pops up.
It seems like it would be impossible to police every single piece of content that gets shared online.
It would be. And there's a lot of debate about how much responsibility social media platforms should have for the content that gets shared on their networks. It's a delicate balance between combating misinformation and protecting freedom of speech.
This is a lot to take in. It feels like we've uncovered a whole web of manipulation and deception. And we're just getting started, so we're going to dig a little bit into the historical side of fake news. You know, it's easy to think of this as a problem unique to the internet age, but the Wikipedia article reminds us that that's not the case at all.
Yeah, humans have been grappling with misinformation and propaganda for centuries. The desire to control narratives, shape perceptions, and influence others is nothing new.
So what are some of the earliest examples of fake news then? I mean, the Wikipedia article mentioned ancient Rome.
Well, think about somebody like Cleopatra. She was obviously a very powerful and influential figure, but after her death, all sorts of fabricated stories and rumors were spread about her to damage her reputation. And these stories often portrayed her as like a manipulative seductress, which played into existing Roman anxieties about powerful women.
It's kind of amazing how some of those same tactics are still used today. You know, smear campaigns and character assassinations are unfortunately nothing new.
Exactly. And these historical examples show us just how effective these tactics can be, especially when they tap into existing societal prejudices or fears.
The Wikipedia article also mentioned something called the Great Moon Hoax of 1835. What was that all about?
Oh, this one is a classic. So a New York newspaper, The Sun, published a series of articles claiming that an astronomer had observed all sorts of fantastical creatures on the moon using this powerful new telescope. We're talking bat-like humanoids, unicorns, even bipedal beavers.
Wait, people actually believe that?
Well, think about it. Back then, the moon was a complete mystery. Space travel was still the stuff of science fiction. The articles were written with this really convincing detail and scientific jargon. Plus, The Sun was a relatively new publication at the time, so people were really eager to believe this, like, sensational scoop.
So it's not that people were more gullible back then. It's just that the context was so different. They didn't have the same access to information or the same level of scientific literacy that we have today.
Right. And this highlights the importance of media literacy, which we talked about in the first part. Being able to critically evaluate information, considering the source, and understanding the broader context is just crucial, no matter what era you're in.
It's also interesting to note that this hoax wasn't even intended to be malicious. The writer was probably just trying to create an entertaining story. but it demonstrates how easily misinformation can spread, even unintentionally.
And how it can have unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Once that information is out there, it can be really difficult to contain or to correct, especially if it taps into people's desires or fears.
Speaking of which, both of our sources point out that fake news often preys on our existing anxieties. Church of Satan News is particularly critical of what they see as media fear-mongering around health issues.
Yeah, they actually cite a specific example from 1984, where the Fresno Bee published a report that was critical of a childhood vaccine. They argue that this was one of the last times that a mainstream outlet dared to publish anything that questioned vaccine safety.
Yeah. So they seem to be implying that there's now this sort of unspoken agreement to suppress any information that might raise concerns about vaccines, even if that information is legitimate.
Yeah, and this really taps into a much broader conversation about who controls the narratives around health and science. And it highlights how difficult it can be to have these open and honest discussions about these complex issues when fear and distrust are so prevalent.
Yeah, and when certain topics become so politically charged, it's just so hard to separate fact from fiction. Speaking of politically charged topics, I'm curious about those forbidden subjects that Church of Satan News keeps bringing up. They seem especially fixated on chemtrails and orgonite.
Right. Well, these are topics that often attract a lot of speculation and conspiracy theories. And this source clearly believes that there's this intentional effort to keep these subjects out of the public eye. They even compare some mainstream media outlets to Pravda, the Soviet propaganda newspaper, which is a pretty strong statement.
Yeah. Do you think there's any merit to their argument, though? Could it be that certain topics are just deemed too sensitive or too disruptive to be openly discussed in mainstream media?
Well, it's certainly possible that some topics might be considered taboo or off limits for various reasons. And it's definitely worth considering why certain voices or perspectives might be marginalized or excluded from public discourse. However, it's also important to be wary of sources that rely heavily on conspiracy theories or present themselves as like the sole arbiters of truth.
So again, it comes back to critical thinking and being able to evaluate sources and information for ourselves.
Exactly. And that includes being aware of our own biases. We all have preconceived notions and beliefs that shape how we interpret information. Being able to recognize those biases and approach information with an open mind is essential.
It's like that saying, don't believe everything you think. We need to be willing to challenge our own assumptions and consider different perspectives, even if they make us uncomfortable.
Well said. And it's also important to remember that misinformation doesn't just come from these fringe websites or conspiracy theorists. It can also come from seemingly reputable sources, including mainstream media outlets.
Right. They're not immune to bias or mistakes. And sometimes, even with the best intentions, they can get things wrong or present information in a way that's misleading.
Which is why it's just so important to be a critical consumer of information, regardless of the source.
So we've talked about spotting fake news and we've talked about the history of fake news, but now I'm curious about how do we combat this? It feels like it's just everywhere. And, how do we actually address this problem?
It's definitely a challenge, but I don't think it's an insurmountable one. There are a number of strategies that are being explored and implemented to address this whole spread of misinformation. The Wikipedia article, for example, highlights the importance of media literacy education.
Okay, so teaching people how to critically evaluate information, recognize bias, identify fake news. I can definitely see how that would be crucial.
Yeah, it's all about empowering individuals to become more discerning consumers of information. Imagine if we could equip everyone with the skills to really dissect a news article, to question the source, to look for evidence, to consider different perspectives. I mean, that would make a huge difference.
Yeah, it'd be like giving everybody a BS detector.
Yeah, I like that analogy. And this is something that can be taught at all levels of education, really, from elementary school to university and beyond. In fact, some countries are already incorporating media literacy into their national curriculums.
That's good to hear. But obviously, education takes time. And the problem of fake news is happening now. What can we do in the meantime?
Well, there's a lot of discussion about the role of social media platforms in combating this. Some people argue that these platforms need to take more responsibility for the content that gets shared on their networks.
Church of Satan News is very critical of companies like Facebook and Google. They claim these platforms are actually profiting from the spread of fake news, and that their algorithms are designed to amplify sensational content, even if it's false.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely this ongoing debate about the ethics and responsibilities of these tech giants. I mean, they have a massive influence on the information ecosystem. And I think it is important to hold them accountable for the role that they play.
But how do you regulate something as vast and complex as the internet without infringing on freedom of speech? It's a really tricky balance.
It is. There's no easy answer. Some solutions that people are exploring include things like fact-checking partnerships, flagging misleading content, and promoting authoritative sources. But as we've discussed, it's a constant arms race. Those who create and spread fake news are constantly finding new ways to evade detection and exploit these vulnerabilities.
So we need to be just as adaptable and innovative in our approach to combating it.
Exactly. It's going to require this multifaceted approach that involves education, regulation, technological solutions, and a collective commitment to truth and accuracy.
So what about those individual actions we can take? I mean, we talked about some tips for spotting fake news earlier, but is there anything else we can do on a personal level to make a difference?
Absolutely. One of the most powerful things you can do is just to be mindful of what you share online. Before you hit that retweet button or share a link, take a moment to consider the source, read the article carefully, and check for any of those red flags that might indicate misinformation.
Like that old adage, think before you speak. But in the digital age, it's more like think before you share.
Precisely. And be willing to engage in respectful dialogue with people who might hold different views. Challenge misinformation when you see it, but do so in a way that is constructive and informative, rather than being confrontational.
So be part of the solution, not the problem.
Exactly. And remember, it's okay to be skeptical. Question your assumptions. Seek out diverse perspectives. And don't be afraid to admit when you're wrong.
Yeah, this deep dive has been such a valuable reminder that critical thinking is more important now than ever. We can't just passively absorb information anymore. We need to be active participants in shaping the information landscape.
I couldn't agree more. The future of our shared reality depends on it.
Well, thanks for joining us on this exploration of media manipulation and fake news. We hope you've learned some valuable tools and insights that'll help you navigate the increasingly complex world of information. Remember, knowledge is power, but only if it's grounded in truth.